it was just amazing how much you could learn by just sort of peeking into people's lives.
In this week's episode of the Mixtape Podcast, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Anna Aizer, professor of economics at Brown University in Rhode Island and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Human Resources. I have had a keen interest in Anna Aizer and her career and her work for a couple of reasons, just actually a lot, but here's two. First, she did her PhD at UCLA when Janet Currie was there, as well as when Guido Imbens was there. Imbens taught there after he left Harvard, for those of you that remember that interview I did with him. Recall my overarching conviction that Princeton's industrial relations section, which was where Orley Ashenfelter, David Card, Alan Kruger, Bob Malone, Josh Angrist originated from, as well as Janet Currie. And my conviction that this was kind of the ground zero of design-based causal inference, and that design-based causal inference spread through economics, not really through econometrics and econometrics textbooks, but really through applied people. She also works with Adriana Lleras-Muney, who's also at UCLA now, who was a student of Rajiv Dehajia, wrote a seminal work in economics using propensity scores, who was also Josh Angrist's student at MIT. So you can kind of see Anna fits my obsession with like a sociological mapping out of the spread of causal inference through the applied community. But putting aside Anna as being like instrumentally interesting, I am directly interested in her work on domestic violence and youth incarceration, among other things. I've followed it super closely, teach a lot of these papers all the time, think about them even more. So in this episode, we basically walk through her early life in Manhattan, to her time at Amherst College, to her first jobs working in nonprofits in areas of reform and poverty, to graduate school. We talked about her thoughts about domestic violence and poverty and crime along the way too, and it was just a real honor and a pleasure to get to talk to her. And I hope you like it as much as me. My name is Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape Podcast. Okay, it's really great to introduce my guest this week on the podcast, Anna Aizer. Anna, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Before we get started, could you tell us your name, obviously your name and your training and where you work?
Sure. So I'm a professor of economics at Brown University. I did my PhD at UCLA many years ago. Before that, actually, I got a master's in public health. So I kind of have a strong public health sort of interest and focus in a lot of my work. I'm also currently the co-director of the NBR program on children. That is a program at the NBR that is focused entirely on the economics of children and families. And I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Human Resources.
Great. It's so nice to meet in person. I've been a long-time reader of your papers because you write about these topics on violence against women, and there's not a lot of people in economics that do, and so and the way that you approach it is sort of like it shares a lot of my own thoughts. So I'm going to talk about it later, but it's really nice to meet in person. Sure,
nice to meet you too.
Okay, well, so I want to sort of break up the conversation a little bit into your like first part, just sort of talk about your life growing up. So, and then the second part, I want to talk about sort of research stuff. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did.
Which borough was it?
Manhattan.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Upper East Side. But when I went off to college, I went to rural Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to Amherst, which is a very small liberal arts college in the Berkshires.
Yeah.
That was a very different experience for me. And believe it or not, I was not an econ major.
Oh, you weren't?
In fact, I was not. I only took one econ course my entire 4 years in college.
Oh, wow. Wait, so what did you major in?
I majored in American Studies So with a focus on colonial American history and literature.
On literature. Oh, that's what I majored in too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So early American history. So what was this was like the 1700s or even?
Yeah. So I did a lot of 1800s, a lot of sort of the New Republic period. And my undergraduate thesis was actually on girls' schooling in the early Republic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. What was the deal with girls' schooling in the early Republic?
What was the deal with the girls' schooling? Well, it depends. So for most of the Northeast, the focus on girls' schooling was really this idea that it was a new country. They were going to have leaders in this new country, and someone had to educate those leaders. Someone had to educate those little boys to grow up to go ahead and lead this country. And so the idea was, well, we had to start educating moms so that they could rear boys who could then go on to lead this great nation.
I see. Women's education was an input in male leadership.
That's correct.
Got it. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I get that. You start educating women, though. I suspect that you get more than just male leaders.
I think that's right. I think that was an unintended consequence.
Unintended consequence. They think that far ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So two sort of infamous, that's a very good point to make, because two women who were educated in one of the first schools dedicated to educating women so that they could go on and rear their boys to be strong leaders were Catherine Beecher, who went on to create one of the most important female, girls' schools in Troy, New York. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
They're related?
Yeah, they are sisters. They are sisters. And they went on, they were one of the first sort of sets of girls who were educated in this mindset of, we need leaders, so let's have some educated moms. And they, of course, had other ideas, and they went and formed schools and wrote incredibly important works of fiction that ended up, playing a pretty significant role in the Civil War.
Wow. You think that was this a thing over in England too, or was this just an American deal?
I don't know the answer to that.
Huh. I guess they have a different production function for leaders in England, whereas it's like very decentralized here or something, right?
Right. So you're saying in England, they already had sort of their system of, you go to Eton and then you go to Cambridge or Oxford. Right. I think that's probably right. So we didn't have that here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you don't even have, you're like creating everything from scratch, and with such a reactionary response to England, who knows what kinds of revolutionary approaches you're taking. I guess that's probably pretty revolutionary, right? Like say, well, we're going to teach women, even though it's kind of like in order to produce male leaders, it's still like thinking outside the box a little bit.
Yeah. I suppose that's true. Yeah.
That's cool. So how come you didn't end up you end up at Amherst? Well, so as a kid in Manhattan, what were you doing? Like, were you interested? You were like reading books and stuff? You were like a big reader?
I suppose so. Yeah. I suppose so.
Is that what drew you to Amherst, a liberal arts college?
I don't really know. I mean, I don't think I actually knew what I wanted until much later in life. And so I was an American Studies major, which was really, at the time, I learned a lot. But I don't think, it took me a while to sort of gravitate to economics. And once I did, it was clear that was really the right path for me.
Yeah. One question I want to leave your kid. So did your parents let you ride the subway when you were a little kid?
Yes.
Oh gosh, I bet that was so cool.
Oh yes. So I grew up in New York City during the 70s and 80s, which was far more dangerous than it was today. But at that time, parents had a much more hands-off approach to parenting. Yeah. And so I was I think I was 8 years old when I started taking public transportation by myself.
Oh my gosh. So it's like
Yeah,
is it like there was like latchkey parents
sure,
back then? So you
sure.
just like jump on the subway. Where are you going at 8 years old in
You go
Manhattan?
to school. You go
You're
to
just catching the
school.
subway to go to school?
Yeah,
Oh, that's so cool.
yeah.
I bet you had a great childhood.
I have to say it was pretty good.
Oh
I
man.
can't complain.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, but it was the same kind of thing. I mean, well, it was very different than Manhattan, but just being able to have that level of, it's like all survivor bias, like the the other kids that are getting
Right,
really neglected and abused. Like,
right,
but those of us that made it out alive, it's like all you have is great memories of being able to do whatever.
right. Agreed.
So
Agreed.
what? So you wrote this thesis. So like at Amherst, did everybody write a thesis? Is that real common? Or
Most
were
people
you
did.
like,
I think like a
oh, okay,
third of the students wrote a thesis. It was very common.
but you're like gravitating towards research though.
Yeah. So I
Yeah,
mean, it was clear that I really, really enjoyed that a
yeah.
lot. And in fact, more recently in my economic research, I have done a lot more historical work
Oh yeah,
than I had done initially. So I think that training has really come in handy.
yeah. What did you like about that project that you wrote your thesis on? What did it make
Well, it
you?
was really a lot of fun. So I focused on two schools in particular. I focused
Mm.
on this school in Litchfield, Connecticut, and another school in Pennsylvania, a Quaker school in
Oh,
Westtown. And those I focused on those two schools because those two schools, for whatever reason, kept a lot of their records. They have
oh my gosh, you
really
got the
wonderful,
records?
yeah, so you have really wonderful archives where you could kind of just go through and read all about what they were thinking about when they founded the schools, what the curriculum should be like, and even some of the writings of some of the students and the teachers.
Oh my gosh.
So it was really just a tremendous amount of fun to read all of that stuff, all that sort
Yeah.
of primary materials.
Oh my gosh. Wait, did you actually have the names of the kids? Did you see their,
Sure,
could
they
you have
had
like
all
linked
of
them to
that.
census records and stuff?
Oh, I guess you could. I mean, this was so long ago before
Oh
people
my
were doing all
gosh.
that kind of cool linking. But yeah, you absolutely could.
Oh, that's so neat. I
Yeah,
wonder where those kids ended up. I mean,
yeah.
so what did it make you feel doing that research? That was so original and just like being out there in these like archives.
Well, it was just amazing how much you could learn by just sort of peeking into people's lives, and
Yeah.
it was just really, um, it was really exciting. It was really fun. And you just felt like you were discovering something new.
Yeah. Yeah. So you liked that. I mean, but that's interesting because some people would be like, oh, discovering something new. I don't even care about that. But you like when you were discovering something new, you were like, I like this feeling.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really did.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
really did.
Yeah. So what happened? So you graduate
So I
and then,
graduated,
go ahead.
and then so my first job was actually working for an alternative to incarceration program in New York City. So I moved back home, and you have to remember this was sort of early mid 90s,
Mhm.
and this was sort of the peak in terms of crime rates in the country and in New York City in particular.
Yeah.
And the
Was that a
jails.
conversation before you say this? When you were like growing up, did your parents was it like you noted like people were cognizant? I mean, it's like now you kind of know, oh, it was the peak because like it's fallen so much. But like
Right.
what was the conversation like as a kid about crime?
Well, so in the 90s in New York City at this time, that was really the crack cocaine epidemic.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of talk about that.
Hmm.
That really did dominate a lot of the media at the time. And, it really was sort of a big concern.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, as we know, the city and the state, not just in New York, but nationally, really responded with very tough on crime
Yeah.
approach, started incarcerating a lot of people.
Right.
So much so that they were really kind of out of space in the New York City jail. So Rikers Island was kind of at capacity.
Mhm.
Even upstate prisons were pretty full. And so the city, not because they were concerned that we were putting too many people in jail, which has, after the fact, we know that we we did put too many people in jail, that there was a cost to these incredibly high incarceration rates. At the time, the concern was that we don't have enough space. So what are we going to do? And so the city funded an alternative to incarceration program for youth. So it was called the Court Employment Project, and it was really focused on kids between the ages of 16 and 21 who were charged with a felony in New York State Supreme Court. And these were kids who were being charged as adults, treated as adults in the system.
Right.
New York City has since raised the age of majority, but at that time it was 16. So we were focused on really younger, 16 to 21, although most of the kids we were working with were 16 to 18.
What kind of felonies are we talking about? Is this the drug felonies, or is it?
Yeah, so a lot of it was, possession with intent to sell, selling, but also robbery. That was pretty common as well. Yeah. And so we were only working with kids that were facing at least 6 months in adult prison, essentially. That was the rule for our program, because again, our program was really focused on trying to reduce the number of people who were being detained and incarcerated for long periods of time. Yeah. So we were only dealing with people who
real quick. So what, you're like in your early 20s?
Yeah, so I would have been about 23.
How did you find this gig? Where you were just going back to New York City, or what was the deal?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to go back home.
Yeah.
And at that time, jobs were advertised in the paper. And so you looked through the help wanted ads and you just sent, cover letters and resumes by mail to, whatever job sort of appealed to you. And so I was interested in those jobs. I was also interested in working with with public defenders, so the Legal Aid Society in New York. I applied for a number of jobs there. So where's this coming from? What's your values exactly at this time? You're like concerned about poverty, or concerned about something? I guess I already was really worried. I was really sort of concerned about low-income kids who were really sort of, I felt already were getting sort of derailed at very young ages in a way that I thought would be very hard for them to recover.
Yeah.
And I think that that sort of sense was really confirmed when I started working, that these were kids who, in a split minute, their lives were just totally changed.
I know.
So certainly in the case of things like robberies, these were often, group of kids with not much to do, just kind of getting into trouble.
Yeah.
And it just getting too far, too quick.
Yeah.
And before they knew it, they were facing 2 to 6 years. I mean, it was just really tragic.
Yeah.
So
I know 6 months, you think about it too. You're looking at these like 6 month in the program that you start looking at 6 months, and you think, oh, it's 6 months. The thing is, those things cascade, because 6 months with a felony record serving prison becomes de facto a cycle of repeated 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. Sure. And you just end up, that's going to be a paper that you end up writing. So I'll hold off on that. But so you end up applying, you kind of like spray the city with all these resumes. And then this thing. So what is this company? This is a nonprofit?
Yep. So it's a nonprofit that had a contract with the city. So they had a contract with the city, and they were funded really because the city could not afford to put any more people on Rikers Island.
So it's like a mass incarceration response almost.
Yeah.
Capacity constraints.
They were at capacity. They needed to do something.
Yeah.
And so what this program was, it was an intensive supervision program. So the kids had to come in at least twice a week and meet with a counselor. Yeah. The counselor would, kind of provide counseling services and also kind of check in on them, make sure they're going to school or working or getting their GED. And then they would write up these sort of long reports. I only worked in the courts. So I wasn't doing any of the counseling myself. I had no qualifications to do that. I worked in the courts. So my job was to screen kids for eligibility for the program, interview them, see if they were sort of good candidates, then talk to their families, talk to their lawyers, and then talk to the judge eventually, sort of about the program and about what we would be doing and why we thought this person was a good candidate.
Yeah.
And then once they were in the program, I would then provide updates or reports back to the judge and the defense attorney to let them know how the individual was doing.
And wait, what is the treatment going to be that this thing's doing?
Again,
it's like it's a deferment of
yeah,
like.
so the idea was, that's exactly right. So the idea is if they made it through the program, it was a 6-month program. If they made it through after 6 months, they would be sentenced to probation instead of jail time.
Yeah,
so
like a deferred adjudication kind of type
concept,
right? Yeah,
exactly. So that was the idea.
Yeah, but it's non-random. I know you're not. You're not thinking about this like the future Anna Aizer is not then, but but it's not random.
No,
it's like all. So what is it? What is it conditioned on? Because you're doing all this, like you're doing all it, right?
So you would look at a kid's record.
Yeah.
You would look at whether or not the kid seemed to have support. So the downside was if a kid didn't make it through the program, they might be sentenced to more time.
Really?
Than they would have, maybe. I mean, the judge would.
Why? Because you're getting a new judge or something?
No, it's the same judge, but the judge says, look, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to, instead of sending you away now for 6 to 18, I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of prove yourself. 6 months, stay out of trouble, complete this program, and then I'm going to sentence you to probation. But if you don't complete the program, I'm going to sentence you to more. Whether they in the end, they might not have actually done that. They certainly didn't tie their hands in any way.
What are they doing? Why is he doing that? Why is the judge doing that? They're trying to deal with some sort of like adverse selection or something. Like they don't want.
Well, I think they want the kid. They want to create an incentive for the kid.
They're trying to create an incentive for the kid. Got it.
Okay.
With like a little scared straight thing, kind of like
a little. I mean, the judges always think that.
Right.
It's not clear that works. I don't think that really matters so much in the decision making of young people. I think it's
Yeah, totally.
But that is certainly was on the mind, I think, of many of the judges.
It's funny though, when I think about this paper that we're going to talk about in a little bit, like it's like you're already aware of, these judges kind of like have a little bit of discretion. They're like saying a bunch of stuff that's like not in the law.
Yeah.
I'm gonna like, if you don't do this, I'm gonna give you penalize. I'm gonna give you a really bad grade at the end with like another year in prison. Like, whereas, I mean, that did that cross your mind that you were kind of noticing that judges were like, like this judge does that and this other judge does not tend to do that? Is that something you could have noticed?
Absolutely. So,
oh wow.
Yeah. So there were many, many judges. Right. So this is Manhattan. This is the main criminal courts in Manhattan. So I have many, many judges, a lot of people. And the way it works is once you've been indicted on a felony, you come before one of these 3 judges. They're called conference judges, and they try to dispose of the case. Either the case gets dismissed or they take a plea deal. But if that doesn't happen, they reach into a bin. It's literally a lottery.
It's like a bingo ball machine.
It's a lottery with all these different, basically judges' courtrooms.
Yeah.
And they pull out a number.
Yeah.
And that's the number of the courtroom you get assigned to.
Yeah.
And right then, if you get assigned to certain judges, for sure that kid is going to do jail time. And if you get assigned to other judges, for sure that kid is going to get probation.
Who knows this? The kids don't. They can't comprehend.
They don't know it, but their attorney will know it.
And then maybe their parents. Although it's like you're with a group of kids that maybe their parents aren't as.
I don't think their parents would know it either. You would know it because you have to remember that all of the judges for the most part, were either defense attorneys or
Yeah.
prosecutors before they were judges. And you
Yeah.
can tell
Yeah.
the judges who were,
Right. Is that the main source of the discretion
think
that you've
so.
noticed?
I think so. I think the judges who were
Yeah. I mean, they're
previously
just such
prosecutors.
different.
Yeah.
It does seem like the prosecutors and the defense attorneys are almost like cut from a completely different
Yeah.
worldview and set of values.
I think that's right.
I had this friend that was a public defender in Athens, and he was like, I mean, I think this is what he said. I'm not gonna say his name because he probably didn't say this, but like I thought he basically said, I don't like prosecutors because they think they are always guilty.
Yeah.
They were like, and it's like, and you could tell like the public defender, they were like, my whole job is to not do that.
Right.
And I can just imagine that shaping, either there's a lot of selection into that, or that just really, you hear that all the time. That's just there's gotta be human capital with that.
Yeah. So I agree. So I think they have a different perspective, which is what draws them to, either defense work or prosecutorial work.
Mhm.
But then you have to remember their jobs are really very different. So the prosecutor, he or she is just dealing with the victims, right? So that's who they're talking to all day.
Right.
The defense attorney is talking to the defendant and getting to know them and their families. And so they really just have very different sympathies.
Yeah.
And the judges come from one or the other.
One or the other.
And so you can see it.
So you're a kid, you're like young person. What are you feeling over the course of this working with this? Like, tell me a little bit about your growth and the thoughts that you're thinking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really felt like these were kids that just got derailed, right? I mean, that these were kids, they were in a very tough situation and they made a decision and they had no idea what the consequences of that were going to be.
Yeah.
Nor should they have. They were 16. It's very hard to know where these things end up. And I did feel as though the criminal justice system was way too harsh.
You could tell. I mean, that was like, because the whole point of this nonprofit you're working on is like a response to such an excessive amount of penalization. They literally don't have any room.
Yeah.
They don't have any room for anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had no room.
You're like,
that's exactly
we're
right.
doing so much punishment. We can't even do it right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these kids, they had they in the juvenile justice and criminal justice system more generally, there's a disproportionate involvement of Black and Hispanic youth.
Yeah.
But they are 100% poor.
Yeah. Right.
So that's the other thing. And that just seemed incredibly unfair to me.
Yeah. Right.
That the, poor kids just, and it's not the case that not poor kids don't also mess up.
Right.
They do.
Yeah. They just can avoid the 10,000, there's 10,000 there's 10,000 events from the mess up to the things that these kids are facing in this program that they have many ways of mitigating it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
There's even in terms of parents spending a ton of money to or just saying you can't hang out with these people, or it's there's a bunch of stuff that poor families just are look, I can, so you're feeling heavy hearted, or so you're you could have gone in a different direction. You could have not gone to graduate school or gone to this master's. So what's the decision criteria where you're thinking, I've got to go in a new direction?
Yeah. So, I mean, at a certain point, I just felt as though I needed more training. And I felt that, so I wanted more of a professional degree. So I got a degree in public health where you learned a lot about, the health system and financing and the social determinants of health. And I just, I felt like I needed, again, more training. I should say I went from that job, not directly back to graduate school, but I went and I worked in a not a homeless shelter, but a service center for homeless people, also in New York City. So I went from the criminal justice system to the homeless system. And I was there for another year. And then I went back to
So
school.
what, like 2 or 3 years total between Amherst and graduate
That's
school?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So you thought, but it's interesting you go to public health because like I think like a lot of people that don't know anything about anything, they'll be like, well, she's doing criminal justice. So I could have seen her going to law school. Now she's going to the homeless thing. Okay, well, maybe she could do social work. So what were the things you were thinking of and how did you end up choosing public health? Because a lot of people don't associate either of those things with public health.
Right.
They heard the word health.
Right. So a couple of things. One, I thought about law school, but I felt as though lawyers deal with the problem after it's happened.
Right.
And I felt like maybe we should focus more on preventing.
Right.
And the other thing, when I work with homeless people, I really did start to feel like this was homeless families are kind of different. I work with homeless single adults. And for the most part, in New York City at that time, all of the homeless single adults had serious mental health problems.
Yeah, right.
I really came to see homelessness as a public health problem.
A mental health problem.
Yeah.
Hence public health. Got it.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Right.
So that's really sort of how I could have done social work, but that's not really what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Because again, but it's funny you say like preventative. So it's kind of like you're thinking, it does to me when I hear that, I'm thinking, oh, Anna's already starting to think about public policy.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't necessarily think that if you were to tell me you went and got a master's of social work.
Yeah. No, I think that's
clinical or much more kind of like working with you would have had that experience and you'd be like, I want to work with these families. Like I want to, but that's not what you thought. So something else is going on. So you're thinking, I want to do what?
Yeah. So I think I really was interested in policy already then.
Yeah. And that makes the Masters of Public Health make a lot of sense.
Correct. Yeah.
I see. So where'd you end up going? Harvard?
So to Harvard. Yeah.
Okay.
I got a master's in health policy and administration.
Yeah.
And then I moved to DC. I worked for Mathematica, policy research for 2 years. And I learned a lot about policy research.
And so are you getting like a quantitative training at the Masters of Public Health when you went?
Yeah, so that's where I really took my first micro theory class and my first statistics class.
Oh.
So I took biostatistics and micro theory there.
Yeah.
And when I worked at Mathematica, I worked with a lot of economists.
Oh.
So most of the senior researchers at Mathematica were economists by training.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I really got exposure to the way economists think about research and policy evaluation. And it was then that I decided I wanted to go back and get a PhD in economics.
Okay, so what was it? What's the deal? Why do you like economics at this point?
Again, so there were the senior researchers at Mathematica were either economists or sociologists or political scientists. And I just felt like the economists had a very clear way in which they sort of set up problems. And I think that goes back to sort of, economic models of decision making.
Right.
And it just struck me that was just a very good way to conceptualize almost any problem.
Mm.
And I also liked the way they thought about data. So really, and I think the people that I worked most closely with and came to admire were all economists. So that's sort of how that.
Well, how long were you there? Were you doing kind of public policy stuff at Mathematica?
Yeah, so I was doing a lot of evaluations of Medicaid programs and so various, in particular, Medicaid managed care, sort of moving from a different financing model for Medicaid and evaluating that in various settings and writing up policy briefs. So that, it was either 2 or 3 years, I can't really remember. maybe 3 years. I think I was there 3 years. And then I went back to graduate school.
And then you go to UCLA.
And then I went to UCLA.
Who did you end up studying? Am I right that you were working mainly with Janet Currie?
Yes. So Janet Currie
pretty
was
closely with her?
Yeah. She was my main advisor. The other folks I worked with were Joe Hutz and Jeff Grager.
And who was who?
Jeff Grager.
Oh, and Jeff Grager?
None of whom are there anymore.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just kind of curious, I sort of associate you a lot with, because I wrote that book on causal inference. I'm obsessed with the causal inference stuff and all these weird ways, with all the people. And I see Princeton industrial relations section, Card, Angrist, etc. And then I see Janet Currie, and then I see you at UCLA, and I associate you so much with that kind of methodological approach, especially for some of the papers that I've known really well. Did you get a sense when you were at UCLA, oh, this is causal inference, this is different, this is the credibility revolution, or was it just really subtle, or this is just how you do empirical work?
That's a great question. So I should also say that my first year econometrics teacher was Guido Imbens.
Was it really?
Yeah, Guido was at UCLA for a short period of time. And I was lucky enough that he was there when I was there. So he taught me in my first and my second years. So of course he, was very much a big part of this. And actually Enrico Moretti was also at UCLA when I was there. So I took courses with him. So I think between Janet, Guido, Enrico, and Joe Hutz, they were really kind of in the thick of it. And that was the way it was done.
That was the way it was done.
That was the way it was done.
Yeah. What did you learn? What do you think the salient concepts were that had you, this is a make believe, right? But I'm just saying, had you gone to a different school where you didn't have any of those people, what do you think the salient econometric causal inference kind of things were to you that you were oh, this is what I notice I keep doing over and over again, or keep thinking about?
Well, I would say that the method was in service to the question. So, one thing I feel as though I'm seeing it more these days is people have they find an experiment, a natural experiment, and then they figure out the question. And that's not how that's not how I remember it.
Right.
Right. You had the question, and then the method was in service to that question. And I worry that that's getting a little bit lost these days, that people kind of have the experiment and then they're searching for the question.
Right.
And I think that ends up being less interesting and less important.
Yeah. There were certain economists, I think, that were so successful as kind of approaching it that way. And, it seems like it was kind of cut both ways, because it seems like causal inference kind of grew on the back, that kind of applied causal inference kind of grew on the back of that kind of natural experiment first. But it almost becomes this, to a kid with a hammer, everything's a nail. And so they're it's just kind of look through the newspaper, look for a natural experiment. What can I do? How can I do this? How can I, and it is funny. It's it does feel I don't think it's as satisfying too, just even emotionally. You think about, I guess you can find discoveries that way like you were, but it does feel like you don't end up building up all the human capital with the importance of that question.
Yeah.
Because you're almost it's almost kind of you're well, how can I make this question really important, as opposed to it is important. Right. What were you studying? So you were studying, I know what you were studying, but so at UCLA, what was the question that you were really captivated by?
So I was really focused on health. And you have to remember, I had just, I'd done a master's in public health, and I just worked at Mathematica. So I was really focused on health. So really all of my dissertation was on health. So my main dissertation chapter was actually on Medicaid in California. And it was on the importance of enrolling kids early in Medicaid. So I don't know if you know much about the Medicaid program, but it's there are many kids, 60% of kids who are uninsured are actually eligible for the Medicaid program, but not enrolled in the Medicaid program. And that's partly because
60%?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we could reduce the number of kids who are uninsured in this country by more than half if we just enrolled all those kids who are eligible for Medicaid in the program.
Yeah.
And part of the
saw that kind of in that Oregon Medicaid experiment.
Yeah, so Oregon was mostly adults. And so I don't know how these numbers differ for adults and kids. I'm really more focused on kids. But it's partly by design, because Medicaid is a program. If you show up at the hospital and you don't have insurance and you're eligible for Medicaid, the hospital will enroll you. And most people know that. Yeah. I mean, because they have every interest.
Yeah.
You know, they want to get paid. So they'll enroll you in the Medicaid program. But, there's a cost to that, because what that means is that kids, if parents know that once they go to the hospital, their kid will be enrolled in the Medicaid program, should they need hospitalization, they don't end up getting them enrolled prior to that. So they miss out on sort of the ambulatory preventative care that might prevent them from being hospitalized to begin with. And that's partly, because of the structure of the program, but that's also because the states made it difficult for kids to enroll in the Medicaid program. So in California, there was a big change. The application for Medicaid used to be 20 pages long. Imagine that, right? They cut it down to 4. Right?
What kind of stuff are they asking on those 20 pages?
Who knows what they're asking?
Good grief.
But,
I mean, they're wanting them on there. Are they screening them out, or are they just like?
Well, I think that's partly what they were trying to do, right?
Because it's expensive. So these you've got some of these legislators that are like, this is expensive and I don't even want to do this. So add a dozen pages.
Yeah. So just make it hard. Right. Now, what happened was in 97 was the Child Health Insurance Program, CHIP.
Yeah.
And they said, if you want CHIP money, so that's federal money to insure more kids, if you want CHIP money, federal money, you are going to have to enroll more kids in the Medicaid program. You have to do outreach. And so the states actually were kind of forced. And that's actually what prompted California to go from a 20-page application to a 4-page application. And they also spent about $20 million on advertisement and, basically training community-based organizations in how to complete a Medicaid application.
Yeah.
So they train them to help, you can help your clients enroll in Medicaid. And for every application that you help that ends up getting onto the Medicaid program, we'll give you $50.
Yeah.
So they actually, and this really mattered. A lot of kids started enrolling in the Medicaid program who otherwise wouldn't, particularly Hispanic and Asian American kids.
Is this what your dissertation ends up being about?
This is what my dissertation was about.
On the payment, on both the shortening and the payment?
So it was basically, once they started doing this,
yeah,
you started seeing big increases in the number of kids who were enrolled in the Medicaid program.
Yeah.
And you saw declines in hospitalizations for things like asthma.
Yeah.
Asthma is a condition for which, if you're being seen and treated on an ambulatory basis, you shouldn't end up in the hospital.
Oh, wait, so what's your control group and all this stuff?
So basically what you're seeing is what the state did was they kind of targeted different areas and provided training to those community-based organizations in how to complete a Medicaid application. And so they gave me all that data.
Get out of here.
I had all the data.
You're doing some IV thing? You're doing some.
Yeah. So it was, basically, if you live in a neighborhood where a community-based organization had already been trained, then you were much more likely to be enrolled in the Medicaid program.
Oh
so
my
you can
gosh,
see that.
So cool. Were you excited when you found that?
I was super excited.
I bet.
Was super excited. And, this was so old. I was begging Medicaid to send me this data.
Yeah.
Begging. And they weren't really answering. And then one day, Janet came in to the office where all the graduate students sit. And she said, I think I got this fax for you. She hands me this 20-page fax that has all the data. on what community-based organization got trained and when.
Okay, Anna. So here, I want to ask a meta question real quick. So you just kind of said, like, some these days people maybe start with natural experiment first, but originally it was question first. Okay, not devil's advocate, but just kind of like a statement of facts. That the one reason they may do that is because, like, when you find these kinds of natural experiments or whatever, it almost just feels like almost itself random. You're like, you weren't even really looking for it. You're like, you read something in the newspaper and you're like, oh my gosh, they're doing this weird thing. Right. And the risk of like going question first is like, you could have this incredibly important question, like, the Medicaid project payment thing. And you're like, I don't have if everybody in my department, if I got like Imbens and Moretti and Currie, who are kind of like to answer a question, either subtly or not so subtly, or like to answer a question is kind of going to require this credible design. And we really need you to staple this dissertation together. You're going to have a credible.
I mean, I think that's why
it seems really risky. It seems
yeah,
really risky.
I think you have to have lots of ideas.
You have to have lots of ideas.
I think you have lots of ideas. And my good friend of mine in graduate school was Moretti's RA. And he told me that Enrico had tons of ideas. And he would have Wes, this is my friend, his RA, would just kind of do some really quick takes on all of these ideas. And if there was something there, he'd pursue it. But if there was nothing there, he'd drop it.
What does that mean? Nothing there, something there.
Well, if you can't find exogenous variation, or the exogenous variation doesn't actually work, you don't have the first stage,
right?
He just drop it and move on to something else.
You got to be, that's a skill, right? That's kind of like, that's almost like some like therapeutic skill, like to be excited about something and willing to let it go.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think
you had a lot of ideas.
I had a lot of ideas that never worked out.
They never worked out.
Yeah.
And that's normal.
I think that's normal.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing.
I think that's how research should go.
Yeah.
And I think in fact, I'm not as good as Enrico. I probably hold on to things for longer than I should.
Yeah. No, that's really, boy, where'd you end up publishing that work? I should know this, but I don't know.
So that published in Restat, Review of Economics and Statistics.
Oh, what cool. So what'd you end up finding?
So what I end up finding is if you pay these organizations to enroll, well, kind of a couple of things. Advertisement, just kind of blanketing the television and radio with, information, sign up for Medicaid, sign up for CHIP. That does not work at all.
Doesn't work. No, advertising doesn't work.
It doesn't work. What works is having these community-based organizations help families complete the application. That's
like
efficient.
a supply demand kind of philosophy that you see in drugs too. It's like Mark Anderson has this paper on meth, and they would post these advertisements of people that were addicted to meth. There was like, they like look horrible, it's like they like lose their teeth and all this stuff.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, because I think you're talking, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like you're talking about a group of people that are like, they need more assistance.
Yeah.
They need somebody, you think about that thing you were saying earlier about like these kids that are higher income versus lower income. It's like when I said there were 10,000 steps that the higher income people had, it wasn't really like the kids. It was like external forces that were like investing on, like going after them.
Yeah.
Right. And it seems like incentives are like need to be targeted to people to like go after. Because for whatever reason, it is not enough to just simply have it. You need people going in and like helping along the way.
Right. Agreed. Wow. I need support.
Yeah. So that is amazing. That is a great, I bet your advisors were so proud of you for that project.
I don't know.
I just think so.
You'd hope so, but that would be icing on the cake.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I guess that's not super important, but
it is. You do always want your advisor. I had a tremendous respect for all my advisors. So yeah, I'd be very pleased if they they liked the work that I did.
Yeah,
Yeah. So basically, states did spend this money to enroll kids early, but it paid off because it meant that they were less likely to be hospitalized. So in fact, some of these programs can be very much cost effective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I had told myself, I was like, well, I'm gonna ask Anna about the juvenile incarceration paper with Joe Doyle, and then I was going to ask her about domestic violence. And I feel like I've got to make a hard choice now because I don't have a lot of time. So I was kind of thinking, well, let's see how this goes, and then we can do it. So domestic violence. Okay. First thing I want to ask is, how did you get interested in that topic, and when did it start? Because I guess it's not. Is it really like, in a way, I can almost imagine. Oh, you've been thinking about domestic violence forever.
Yeah, so
you've been thinking about women ever since college. Yeah,
that's true.
Right.
I hadn't made that connection. So this was basically my first big project after I started at Brown. Right. So after my dissertation, I was kind of thinking, okay, what's my next big project going to be? And I think that's a very important decision for junior faculty to think about. After you finish publishing your dissertation, you got to think about what's my next big project.
Right.
And because it takes so long to publish anything in economics, that's really going to matter a lot. That might be the only thing you publish before you come up for tenure,
right?
Given how long. And so I was thinking about it, and I just felt like I didn't have a clear question in mind, but I, just kind of been looking at the numbers. It's incredibly prevalent, domestic violence, right? But it's also shown some pretty encouraging trends, right? So domestic violence against women has been declining pretty significantly. In the US, I think I haven't looked the number up recently, but it was about 1,000 women a year were being killed. And so many more are victims of domestic violence. And if you look at victimization surveys, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women in the US report ever being the victim of domestic violence. It's really prevalent. And it was just struck me like, this is a big problem. And I don't know how to answer it, but we should know more about it.
Yeah.
Given just how prevalent it is.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I started. I have a good friend from high school, and she's a lawyer in New York City, and she was working with victims of domestic violence. And what struck me, she's a lawyer by training. She used to say these women have nothing. They have no resources. They are so poor.
Right.
And so it just, that kind of, to me, it just sort of made me think about, okay, I need to start thinking about income and resources and poverty and domestic violence, because clearly, that's a big part of this.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's so funny. Like, I feel like you and I ended up responding to the bargaining theory papers in the exact same way. Because now that's like when I was studying a lot of my stuff on couples and things, and bad behavior on the part of the men. I was always thinking about sex ratios in the marriage market, and just and why I was thinking about that was the ability to exit the partnership could be really, really important. And I was curious, when, you can talk about people not having resources and not necessarily be thinking in terms of one of these Nash bargaining, Mansur Brown and McElroy and Horn and Shelley Loomberg kinds of ways of thinking. I was curious, were you thinking about those theory papers a lot, or am I just projecting?
Well, I mean, again, it first started with this idea that, and so I had this friend, again, who was working and, telling me, just how poor many of the women she was working with were. And then once you actually look at the statistics, the survey statistics, it's true that any woman can be a victim of domestic violence, but it is really a poor woman's problem.
Yeah.
So it's very clear to me that poverty has a lot to do with it. And it's because these women have no other, many of these women have no other source of support.
Yeah.
They have low levels of schooling. They have few prospects in the labor market.
Yeah.
And they're really stuck.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately
Stuck as in cannot leave.
Cannot leave. I mean, they have a very,
because that's the solution.
that's
One of the most important solutions, which is probably you need to leave the relationship.
Yeah. Or you need to be able to threaten to leave.
You need to be able to threaten to leave. How important do you think the credible threat is? Because my sense is like that's like to an economist, because they're like used to thinking about unions and stuff. They're like, oh, yeah, credible threats. Like that's all you got to do. You never have to do it. And I feel like I don't know if that really works. Like I actually think it's like the truth is you're gonna have to leave, because and maybe there's some marginal guy, right? We're talking about the marginal guy, but like the whatever, that's the inframarginal, whatever. The extensive marginal guy is like, he's like got narcissism, personality disorder, substance abuse problems.
Yeah,
he's got major problems, and that stuff is very inelastic to everything.
Yeah, you may be right. There's, I can't answer this because I don't know for sure. At the same time, I remember talking to, some folks about this, and their feeling was that it's all kind of a continuum of a bad relationship. Violence may be one extreme, but, relationships have ebbs and flows. They can be better at some points and worse at others. And so they did feel as though a relationship didn't always have to be violent, right? That you could have relationships that were violent at one point, but then were no longer. Of course, you also have relationships in which that's not the case, and the only solution is to leave. But there could very well be relationships that where you can have better and worse periods. But
the reason why I bring it up is because I feel like these days you hear a lot about mental health you hear about mental health period, but like in domestic violence, there'll be also an emerging story of the narcissist personality disorder. And I've been always lately thinking of like, I wonder if this is true. Because like anecdotally, what you see a lot is how manipulative, that's like a very judgmental way of putting it, but I don't know how else to say it. How manipulative one of the person can be towards the other, where they're like, well, if you loved me, they get all this like trapped up stories about love. Love becoming almost this story. And I've wondered, for those people that can't or won't, it's actually won't, right? They can leave. So it's more of like, there are some people, they will be literally harmed if they leave. So I'm not talking about those people, but I mean like the person that literally you're watching an equilibrium where they don't leave. I've wondered lately if it's like their view, the victim is all tangled up with loyalty and love. And it is taken advantage of by a person that they don't, no one can tell them not to love this person. That's like nobody's business.
It is a really complicated thing.
It is so complicated. It is so complicated, especially when it's like, finding the policies that provide resources to a person, especially if it's like, some of that might be a person that's at those earlier ebbs too. Those earlier ebbs in the bad relationship, and you're like, well, some people may not be ready to leave yet.
All right. This is the sort of thing where I do think the right policy response is providing resources to women, but also probably interventions aimed at the assailant. Is probably going to be just as effective. Sorry, my phone is ringing.
That's okay. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I thought it might be
Yeah.
my kids.
I wonder about these battery, these battery courts. Have you heard about these diversion
Yeah, I
courts?
mean,
I wonder if they are what do you
yeah,
know about those?
yeah, not a lot, I would say,
Yeah, I don't think
actually.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think this is like these issues of poverty and mental health and
yeah,
all of these things interacting uh in order to get, healing and healthy, meaningful lives to everyone is I do think this is something that economists can offer, but
yeah,
it's not something that I wouldn't say there's a ton of people. You're one of a small number of people working on domestic violence.
yeah.
Seems like.
It's very hard. I mean, it's a very hard thing to study. Data is very difficult to come by for obvious reasons,
Mhm.
for good reason, right? I mean, this is data that needs to be protected.
Mhm.
You know, Jens Ludwig and the crime lab in Chicago, I mean, they're doing work around violence reduction more generally.
Mhm.
And probably many of those principles and findings probably relate to domestic violence as well, kind of
Mhm.
changing the behavior of young people so that they are less quick to react
Right.
and less quick to react in a violent way when they do, would probably have some pretty important spillovers to domestic violence as well,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways to reduce violence more generally that would
Yeah.
probably apply to the setting of domestic violence.
Yeah. It's funny, like going back now, circling back to that judge who threatens with higher penalties. I think like economists, when they think about violence and things like that, you're an exception for thinking about outside options and stuff like that. But like they're so the shadow of Gary Becker's deterrence hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's like it can just be this like straitjacket for a lot of people because
Yeah.
they just only think in terms of relative price changes on the punishment margins.
Yeah.
And when you talk to psychologists or you read that psychology literature about narcissism or borderline personality disorder or substance abuse, you're talking about a group of people that are like, for a variety of reasons, have really low discount rates or just like have beliefs that things don't apply to them, or like in no uncertain terms, like the elasticities of violent behavior with respect to some, unknown punishment that you don't even know if it's going to real. It's like, it just seems like we don't really know, but it's really big.
Yeah. So there was this criminologist named Mark Kleiman. Do you know that?
Oh yeah, Mark Kleiman. Yeah.
I mean, his big thing was it should be swift, sure, and short.
Yeah.
Right? That's how we should do punishment.
Yeah.
That's, that's a very different, he felt as though that would be far preferable to the system in which there's uncertainty, but if it doesn't work out, you're going to spend a lot of time in jail. Like he thought that was a terrible model.
Swift, certain, and did you say short?
Short.
Yeah. Well, with prison sentences lingering on your record, it is by definition never short.
Yeah.
You face these labor market scarrings, and you can't get housing, you can't get jobs, and that does not go away.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So even if the prison sentence is short, the person, this is just I just feel like this is the tension around violence in the country, which is like punishment has so many margins where it is permanent.
Yeah.
It's got so many margins, and just being in a cage is only one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, particularly for young people, jail is incredibly scarring.
Scarring. We've been studying suicide attempts in the jail, and we
yes, that's right.
Yeah, we walked the jail, for this one particular jail. I have never in my life seen anything like that. I've been working on this project for 4 years. Hadn't walked to the jail. I don't know. It's not the first thing that came to my mind. And so the team finally walked the jail. I spent the whole day there. And, the jails have so much mental illness in it, and they just are it's not even cages. It's like a cage has, air gets in.
Yeah.
Like it's like a sealed box. It's like Houdini's, box, and they stay there. And for a variety of regulatory reasons and so forth, they stay in there. Can't have a lot of materials if they are, at risk. If they've come in with like psychosis because of substance abuse or underlying mental illness stuff, they might get moved into certain types of physical quarters.
Yep.
I just can't even imagine less than an hour.
Yeah.
Let alone, and that's just jail. That's not even prison.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely a trauma box.
Yeah.
And you come and that, and this is, unfortunately, we didn't get to talk about your paper with Joe Doyle on the juvenile incarceration, but every time I teach that juvenile incarceration paper where kids were incarcerated as a young person and then end up not going back, it's not even the future prison part. It's the not going back to high school.
Yeah, of course.
And then when they go back, they're labeled with a behavioral emotional disorder. It's like, it's really like anybody that's had any exposure to a kid involved in corrections, you're like, oh, I know exactly what that is. They were traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, it's not, there's no, like, you don't even have to come up with some exotic economic theory. Like they were traumatized. They can't, that's why they come back to school with a behavioral emotional disorder. It is endogenous.
Yep.
Oh, that paper is one of the most important papers I have personally ever read. I teach it nonstop, and I've even cried teaching it in class. I get so emotional when I get to that part, because I don't know about you, but it seems like it's really hard not to come away with, like, a lot of papers you read, you're like, well, we're not really sure, exactly all of the make of it. But when I read that paper that you wrote, I just think, especially when you kind of think about the leniency design, I just think these kids probably didn't need to go to prison.
Oh yeah.
It's just like, what else are you going to say? They end up committing more crimes.
Yeah.
And they are not going back to school.
Yeah.
How was this the policy goal?
Yeah.
What was it like writing that paper when you started to realize?
Well, I mean, it was very, again, when I worked in this alternative to incarceration program, we had kids come into the program who had spent some time in jail. And we had kids who had spent very little time, maybe just a night.
Yeah.
And the kids who had spent even just like 3 weeks in jail, they always did worse in the program. Always. It was a known fact. The program knew it. And the question was, well, are these kids somehow different? I mean, there was a reason why they were in jail and these other kids weren't. And is that why they do worse in the program? Maybe they're in jail because their family didn't show up for them in court. They couldn't make bail. Or was it something about spending 3 weeks in jail that just made it impossible for them to complete the program?
Yeah.
And so this was a big question that was on everybody's mind. We talked about this quite a bit at the program, and we didn't know the answer.
Yeah.
And when I finally, figured out how to do it, working with Joe, I wanted to know the answer to a question that I had been thinking about for over a decade.
Gosh, were you emotionally upset when you started to see coefficients get really big?
It really was not surprising, because it really wasn't, because these are kids who are only marginally attached to school.
Yeah.
Right. These are not the kids who were, going to school, doing well in school, these were kids who were not really that attached to school for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And so you take them out, even for a month.
Yeah.
They're not going to go back. I mean, it's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
So, we saw that in the program, a lot of kids, what they ended up doing was moving a lot of kids from school to GED because they just they had not been involved in school. They were not involved in school. It just was much more likely that they would be able to complete a GED than actually go back to high school and finish.
Your paper, it like hit home for personal reasons. Is like we had like an event happen, and then it's like I literally was like, I wrote a professor. I was like, this thing had happened, and I was like, the Anna and Joe find this result, and I just think like I feel hopeless, and so I've like, there's like this kid in town, and I like raised money for him. I mean, basically I was like, you just got to do everything in your power to not let them spend an extra minute in jail, and all this like scared straight stuff that and parents get into it too.
Yeah.
They're kind of like exhausted. They're like, well, he's got to learn his lesson. Nobody learns a damn thing in jail. They don't learn a lesson. I mean, I know it's like, because you're just so hopeless. You're like, you start grasping at straws, and people will tell you that might happen. Right.
Yeah.
And I just kind of keep thinking to myself, look, just get them out of jail, and then just let the like whatever the folklore is, like let the folklore about how to help a kid happen outside of jail. Get them out of jail, and then just like let the next thing. But the thing is, they need so much help. They need these kids that end up getting tangled up with they do these petty larceny things. They're high on Xanax, and they do these petty larceny things, and it just starts adding up, and you're like, you get them out, and you just realize you're like, oh, okay, now where's the massive infrastructure to help them? And you're like, there's not one. So then they just keep getting arrested, and they keep getting arrested, and you're just feel like. Then you're kind of like going, well, how many lottery tickets do I have? How many lottery tickets is the optimal number of lottery tickets to always be buying, so that you're diversifying, so that one time maybe it clicks, and you're just like, I don't have the budget constraint for it.
Yep.
I mean, it does seem like it is very, I find it hard to be hopeful sometimes, when you work on these projects. That I think that's part of it. Like when you work on projects around violence and kids and like jail, it can make you hope. It can make you feel hopeless. I actually kind of, even with your paper, just kind of feel like I'm like, okay, the goal needs to be to avoid this. Like, but then you just think, but nobody's listening to an economist.
Well, a couple things. The rate of juvenile detention has been falling pretty steadily. The trends look very different from adult incarceration and detention, which have only started to fall more recently. Juvenile detention and incarceration has been falling. And actually, I was speaking with some policymakers who said that a 2013 National Academy of Sciences report on juvenile detention was really very impactful. And that it made very clear that detaining and incarcerating youth was a terrible idea. And so lots of things have changed in response. And the federal policy in this space is to do everything can be done to reduce the number of kids that are detained and incarcerated. Now, most of these kids are being detained and incarcerated in local and state jails and prisons, right? The federal government isn't actually jailing people, so their policy levers are more limited.
Right.
But policy makers, at least at the federal level and increasingly at the state and local level, do understand that incarcerating youth is a bad idea. And rates have been falling.
Yeah.
So that's the good news.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things in this podcast series I've been like kind of gradually beginning to focus on is how so much of changing policy from the perspective of the individual scientist is the long game.
Yeah.
And you're like, you are doing things and just kind of almost knowing that this is a part of a larger process that takes a long time, and the work matters.
Yep.
It matters. It's important, to be to tell the truth and do good work and do your best, even to get it published in the top journal so that people take it really seriously.
Yeah.
Too. It's really so, it's so nice to talk. I really mean it. I've felt just such a strong kind of inspiration and things that I've learned from you, and how you do ask questions and how you answer them. And I watch you get administrative data. That was the thing with that Joe Doyle paper. I watch you get administrative data. I think, oh, I could get administrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's really, really been, for me personally, just looking, I kind of have watched you be an economist and just sort of use it to kind of navigate a little bit about like, okay, Anna's doing this and it's possible to do this.
Yeah. I got to give a shout out to Joe Doyle, because he was the one that was able to access that Chicago data.
Golly, just all that linking.
Yeah.
It seems like it's an early linking paper even.
Yeah. Shout out to Joe more generally. He was a great co-author on that project.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And
thank you, Scott.
Let me
it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.